Just by way of introduction, my name is John DePaulo, Chief Strategy Officer with a company called Axis. We are part of the Antares Vision Group. And what I want to talk about today, and it'll have a returnable transport item slant to it, but it won't be all about returnable transport items. But really how you can think about working through the complexity and adding information, kind of to your supply chain to kind of lower the risk, right? So there's a lot of risk in supply chain today. There's a lot of information floating around. Kind of one of the things that I want to spend some time talking about over the next 20 minutes or so is some areas that we think about, as a provider of supply chain solutions. I'm going to give the 1-minute commercial, and that'll be the end of the commercial for the discussion. But Axis is part of the Antares Vision Group. We've been around for almost 30 years at this point. We kind of cut our teeth in integrating barcode, RFID, and other data collection technologies into ERP. Did a lot of work with SAP and other big ERPs. So, we're very well versed in how you get the information and what do you do with the information. And we work across multiple verticals as well. So we've seen a lot of different systems and what works and what doesn't work. Our booth, if you want to get into more details about the solution, is we have one right over here in the returnable packaging pavilion. So can discuss the company and kind of what we do, but that's not what I'm here for today. What I'm here for today is really to talk about kind of supply chain risk and how you can build intelligence into your supply chain processes to minimize that risk. This picture here is actually a picture from the Chicago River. And in there are returnable transport items. So I'm pretty sure that whoever bought those items or who was counting on those items didn't expect them to end up in the Chicago River, because at some point in time they're going to need them to do something, right? So, I just put that out there in the fact that, supply chain is not random, meaning there's orders and expectations and shipments and things like that. However, what happens in the supply chain is random. And what we want to do is think about how we can minimize that risk, how we can apply intelligence wherever possible into products as they move through your supply chain, and ultimately get a picture as to kind of what's moving through the supply chain, how it's moving through the supply chain, and what do I do with those exceptions. The other thing, that you need to think about, and I think this is where you get a very robust view of the supply chain. When we put in solutions, when other solution providers put in solutions, one of the traps that you can't fall into is building out a silo-based solution for a single purpose. In today's world, that just doesn't really work. So, when we think about how am I going to implement a solution, who am I going to talk to in order to make sure that that solution does more than one thing, right? So on our examples here, am I a QA manager and I want to make sure that, things that are going through the supply chain are managed properly, that if I'm shipping food as an example, that it's managed in a way in the right temperatures with expiration date management, all those types of things. If I'm a production planner, how can I look at the availability of not only raw materials and transportation, but here in the returnable packaging pavilion, how do we think about, do I have enough returnable transport items to ship the product that I need to ship kind of out into the supply chain? As a plant manager, I need to make sure that my systems are running on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in a predictable way. So how can I start to build a supply chain solution, leveraging things like returnable transport items and other things, that doesn't fill one pain point, but really goes across the enterprise? So that's the way that I like to think about it, is what personas can I get involved in the discussion around systems that I'm putting in early in order to make sure that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. The other area is really, how do we think about this from a technology perspective? So what technologies, what items am I going to add, kind of into the technology stack in order to make it work properly and the way that I want it to long term? So we're starting to see some significant changes in the industry. And probably the biggest one that we're seeing right now is this move towards serialization. So managing items at a batch level is fine, but it's really not what's going to get you and move the needle from a supply chain visibility perspective. So when you think about systems, how can I put in a system that manages serialized and non-serialized information for my products as they're moving through the different points in my supply chain so that I can address the different supply chain changes that are coming into the world right now? We're working on an interesting project with a major produce manufacturer where ultimately they're going to be identifying each individual clamshell down to the unique item and track that through the supply chain. And they're going to use that for their own benefit, and obviously they're going to use it for their customers' benefit. That's a major change in the way people are thinking about serialization and the management of data. The other thing that we are seeing today, which I think is super important, and if you walk the floor, you'll see a lot of new technology. You'll see a lot of new sensors. You'll see a lot of new ways of capturing information. You'll see much more granular information. So being able to build a solution that can absorb all of that information as new technologies come on board is key to the systems as well. Analytics, machine learning, everyone's talking about artificial intelligence. Obviously, that's going to be a key part of all systems that are going in today, but only, if you think about it, if you have clean, verifiable data that you're putting into the system. It does us no good to build an entire system on AI if I can't verify the information that's going into the system. Bad information in is just going to be quicker bad information out as we go through this process. And then a stakeholder, I think, of any system that you think about in order to minimize risk is really, am I tying any of these systems that are doing tracing, tracking, trace, and traceability, am I tying that into my business systems from a financials perspective? So do I have real-time ERP integration so I can verify information as it's going through the supply chain? Because at the end of the day, that's how you're going to do your billing, that's how you're going to do your receiving, that's how you're going to do your shipping, that's how you do your product management. If the subordinate systems that help you track that are not tied tightly to that ERP system, again, you're going to wind up with a system that's very siloed. Technically, it will have a limited lifespan. Yes, it will do something, but it's not going to give you the benefits that you're looking for. The other piece, when we start to think about what am I going to do with partners, how connections matter, right? So being able to utilize new packaging technologies and multiple packaging technologies in order to drive visibility is key. Because if I'm a manufacturer and I have the same process that runs day in and day out, the products run typically the same way, I might be able to utilize an RFID-based system to do that product tracking or that reporting, or a barcode system. But as it moves down through the supply chain, what we see is the need for these multimodal solutions in order for other people to participate. Because what you want, and again, it goes back to that data verification and closing the loop, is you want your downstream partners to participate. You want them to be able to manage and read your products. And if you approach this from a multimodal capability, what it will do is extend the reach of your product. And what we're also seeing now, and you all see it every day, is as cloud becomes more and more ubiquitous, it's going to be easier to get that information. One of the challenges that customers often come to us with is, how do I get my partner to participate? How do I get them to send me the information that I need to close the loop? Previously, there was significant technological hurdles to make that happen. That is getting easier and easier and easier to do. It's not done. There's still technological hurdles, but if you think about the realm of possibility, how I'm going to share information, how I'm going to manage information, and how am I going to mark my products and the containers that they go in, right? So the other thing you can think about as you look at it from a returnables perspective is the returnable transport item becomes the proxy for the product that's in it. So if I do that association to the returnable, I can now use that larger item to track that through my supply chain. And when you think about it, if you have products that may be batch managed today, that may be going to serialized, but you're putting them in totes or pallets or other items to ship, can you easily assign context data to that entire unit to give it more value, right? So this concept of being able to leverage attributes and context data on your shipments, on the products that you're shipping through, and add additional pieces of information becomes key, again, to that flexibility and the value of what it is that you're moving through the supply chain. When you think about this from an ERP perspective, most products have characteristics at the batch level, that get filled in as they move, from manufacturing through shipping and out into the supply chain, but that typically is not a very flexible environment. So this ability to add context data at the carrier level or at the product level and change that context out over time becomes additive to what your ERP knows, and then always being able to tie that information back. So just an example, we've done a number of different projects, but this is a good one. They started with the concept of what I want to do is I send totes out. I want to count the totes that go out. I want to count the totes that come back. There's value to that, right? So we're working, just as an example, to put some scale on it. We're working with a customer who has 8 million returnable transport items that they ship they have 8 million, a fleet of 8 million. They lose 30% of those a year. They're $10 a piece. 30% of 8 million times 10 is a big number. It's worth it just to track that. But when you start to add context onto those items, which include product information, which includes who touched it last, which includes where it went, which includes how am I going to get it back, then that becomes much more valuable, right? Because now I have business context data associated with it, I have product context data, and I have accountability data associated to that unit or those groups of units. So thinking about it that way really starts to build a bigger case for why you should be doing it. One of the things that everyone I talk to struggles with is how do I pay for these systems? How can I get a return on my investment for these systems? Now, obviously, tracking returnables and tracking product and managing that process will give you a return. But if you can start to add all of this additional business context data to it, the return becomes very valuable to all of those personas that I talked about at the start of the presentation. So you can start to get buy-in, and it's a whole lot easier to get buy-in for projects from multiple departments than it is for a single group to pay for everything. So again, something to think about as we get started and go through this. The real value, and I'm going to talk about some examples here, but the real value that you wind up with at the end of the day is what do I do with the information? At the end of the day, this is a data play. This is a data and process improvement play. So if we look at this grouping of dashboards just as an example, the one on the upper left corner was a customer that we worked with who dealt completely at the batch level. And then we moved them to a serialized container tracking with product inside of the containers. And what they were able to spot very, very quickly was all of the little micro inefficiencies that they had inside of their supply chain that they couldn't see when they were dealing with batch level data and moving that through. So there's these bottlenecks that become very apparent when you start to track product kind of at a lower, more granular level than you're doing it today. The lower left analytics was super interesting. It's tough to see, kind of what that one looks like. But what that did, this was for a company that had very sophisticated returnable cylinders that they used a third party to do inspection and maintenance on. They would look at the date of inspection and maintenance expiry, and they would say, okay, we need to send these out to this third party on this date in order to get them inspected. What they didn't know was that it took that third party like 3 times as long for each individual cylinder than they expected. So the inspection date was actually much further back on the timeline than they had anticipated. So they would wind up with 15, 20, 30% of their fleet stuck in inspection and maintenance activities because they didn't have that visibility. So when we put this layer on top, you could then manage that inspection and maintenance activities, kind of in a much more granular level. I want to go to one of my favorite views of why this starts to become important and how you can, again, manage risk. I've talked to a couple people here this week who talked to me about, as an example, if you are a chemical producer and you don't have cylinders to put chemicals in, it's tough to make, right? So, not having the right mix of returnable assets at the right point in time becomes a challenge. And if you try and manage that kind of on its own and keep things kind of balanced properly, it becomes very challenging. So this dashboard here that was built took into account, with integration back to their ERP system, what was their production schedule over the next week, the next month, the next scheduled planning. That was the yellow bars on that graph. The blue and gray bars represented assets that were either in hand or assets that were coming back. So you see, like on the 5th day, they're in big trouble because their production schedule says they're going to make X, and they do not have enough returnable transport items to put that production in. So they have two choices. They can rush ship things around the supply chain. Actually, they have 3 choices. They can shut down production, or they can buy more assets. All 3 are bad choices, right? So if you can start to proactively plan what your needs are from a returnables perspective based on ERP data and tie all that together, it becomes very interesting. And then the bottom chart there on the right-hand side, we built a little model that says, by the way, if you keep running like this, here is the cost in lost sales that you're going to have for not having this all tied together, right? So then it starts to put it in dollars and cents perspective, and it becomes, again, meaningful to everyone. So again, utilizing returnable assets, utilizing integration into ERP, and being able to tie those things together makes for a much more valuable system. So I want to go through just a quick customer example, and it's going to reference back to the returnable transport item discussion that I had before. So we had a large U.S. bakery, as I mentioned, 8 million-ish returnable items that they have within their fleet, 30% loss annually. So the process that we are doing now is we are, through the use of RFID tags, we're RFID tagging each individual basket. We've got about 4 million of them tagged so far. When they do distribution assignment, they have these stacks of baskets with product in it. And we are associating all of those individual baskets to the routes that that stack is going to. Then as they go out the door, we're tracking them outbound. We then have portals set up to track those baskets coming inbound after they've been out in the field. And then we're providing them with dwell time and fleet management and balance and those types of things at the returnable level. Makes perfect sense. They're going to get an ROI like tomorrow by putting that in. And how are they going to do that? Well, I'm not going to stop the basket loss at their customers. I don't have that capability. But the capability that I do have is I can tell them, and if you think about it, I can go to a customer and I go to a customer today and I sent you 60 baskets. I'd like them back, please. And they say, no, you didn't. However, if I rephrase that slightly and I say, I sent you these 60 baskets on this date, it becomes a much different conversation. I'd like them back, please. And I will credit you when I get them back because I can identify with 100% accuracy that I sent them and with 100% accuracy that I got them back. So all of a sudden you're having a different conversation with your customer because I'm able to not only prove the data that I'm sending you, but work collaboratively with them. So that's interesting. That's going to help solve the basket problem because now I can target individual customers who are bad actors in the supply chain. I can reward the ones who return things back to me, and I can have discussions with the ones who don't. And the system itself is learning, so it will send alerts and when dwell time gets too high and things like that, so people don't have to do things. But that's not the most interesting part of the solution. With the advent of things like robust machine vision, what we can do now is we can identify the product that's in the basket through a machine vision. I can associate things like expiry date, what customer it's going to, what the product is, all of the attributes to the basket. That gets delivered to the customer. I now have not only a perpetual inventory of product that's in transit, But because I can get sell-through data from those customers, the large ones at least, I can now start to map that against the inventory that was shipped out to that customer with a great deal of granularity, to the level that I know in reasonable terms how much product they have that's close to expiry, because it hasn't, as I moved it through there. And am I always shipping the right product to the right customer in the container that I shipped? So it becomes a vehicle for compliance. It becomes a vehicle for managing inventory in a pretty interesting way at customers that I never had before. And I'm cutting my costs from a returnable perspective because I'm able to manage that loss. And if I cut it to 15% from 30%, that's a pretty significant savings. And the other thing that they talk about is if they can change the turn by 1 day on all of those assets, it's literally millions of dollars back into their supply chain. Because guess what? They have too many. They have way too many returnable transport items in their fleet because it's an unmanaged process. So, things to think about as you start to look at how can these solutions work for my business? How can I build a foundation that then I can put additional data elements on top of in order to build a robust solution that's going to stand the test of time? Too many times we see these siloed solutions that work great, but they don't quite provide the information and they can't scale horizontally. So that's one thing. The other thing which just to spend a minute or two on is think about how you're going to roll these out. Pick a spot where it makes sense, where you can pressure test the entire solution, right? Because I always use the 3 Ps of systems, which is pilot becomes production and production becomes permanent. If you have a bad pilot, you're going to wind up with a bad production system, and then it's tough to get rid of it. So, think about that. How can I pressure test the system? How can I involve additional stakeholders? Doesn't mean you have to roll the whole thing out on day one. But if I test it in a perfect facility and with the perfect supply chain and the perfect circular, process, when I get into the real world, it's not going to work as good. So, things to think about as you roll these types of systems out.